Rising. I'm Amber Athey, and we're back with another Friday edition of the show. Once again, I'm joined by Jessica Burbank. Jessica, good morning.
Good morning. Happy Friday. It's good to be back.
Absolutely. We've got a big show today, so let's get right into it. Yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled affirmative action in college admissions to be unconstitutional. Shortly afterwards, President Biden hit out at the court while taking questions from the press. Let's watch.
Not going to let this break us. Thank you.
President Biden, the Congressional Black Caucus said the Supreme Court has thrown into question its own legitimacy. Is this a rogue court?
This is not a normal court.
Should there be term limits for the justices, sir?
After yesterday's decision, the president tweeted out an action list of steps the administration is taking to counteract the court's ruling, including by providing colleges and universities with clarity on what admissions practices and additional programs to support students remain lawful, convening a national summit on educational opportunity, and analyzing data to increase access to educational opportunity for underserved communities.
Now, conservative-leaning pundits are championing the decision as anti-racist. Tim Rush tweeted, quote, "This is Harvard's admission rates based on race." And then he miscites a study where he says Asians are admitted at 12.7%, whites at 15.3%, Hispanics at 31.3%, and Black students at 56.1%. Continuing, it was actual systemic racism, but labeled affirmative action. That's what the Supreme Court ruled against this morning. Next up, corporate hiring practices. So on the other side of the aisle, liberals decried the decision as a step backwards. Let's check in on MSNBC.
It's a sea change because what's going to happen, as Charles said, which happened in California, is, look, we're not going to take race into account anymore in our public colleges and everything will be fine. And as we see, that's not happening. So it is not preferential. Race is one factor. And it's not like, okay, as I said, there were only 3 Black people in my law school graduating class. And that probably was affirmative action. But now that schools no longer have to consider race, I fear what will happen and will there be many lawyers who look like Charles and I in the future, or doctors or accountants. It is a problem, and it's not preferential treatment.
I think that's right, that it's not preferential treatment to admit students, to have the students within Harvard's gates or other colleges' gates be representative of the population outside of the college. This was a policy that was pursued in response to less Black, less minority students being admitted to schools because of discrimination. And so I think it's just a dangerous time to get the research wrong. Tim Rush tweeting that when really those figures were not admissions rates. That was the proportion of Black students who perform in the top academic decile that were admitted. So if you have 26 Black students that end up in the top academic decile, about 13 of them would be admitted to Harvard. Those proportions don't make up 100%. That was just within each racial group. What proportion was admitted that was within the top academic decile. And so it was a really misleading tweet that got a lot of people really angry and not understanding what affirmative action is. Do I think affirmative action is the answer? No, it's a Band-Aid on a much larger problem. And has been an excuse to not pursue the policies that would actually address the lower quality education in our segregated schools that are predominantly non-white. I think we have to address the issue of educational disparity at its root, which is there. And so I hope that we respond to this by doing that. I'm not confident we will.
Yeah, I actually agree with your last point that the problem of individuals from minority groups having lower test scores or lower GPAs is an issue that has to be addressed well before colleges. And unfortunately, the way affirmative action works is it does punish people who have better educational outcomes at that point during their application process simply because of their race. The other problem with affirmative action is that it treats racial groups as monoliths. So because of the racial classification system in America, the son of a Nigerian ambassador would get the same racial preference as the grandson of a sharecropper because they both have black skin. That's obviously not right or fair for anyone involved. And the affirmative action at Harvard, the reason that this case gained so much ground so quickly was because they found that it wasn't white people who were bearing the brunt of the negative side effects of affirmative action. It was actually Asian Americans who 20, 30 years ago would have been considered a marginalized group in the United States. But now we're supposed to pretend that they have some kind of privilege because they have higher test scores on average than their white, black, and Hispanic counterparts.
Yeah, I think to the point about socioeconomic inequality within racial groups, that's definitely a shortcoming of what affirmative action has allowed universities to do, which is within those racial groups, there are far fewer Black students who end up going to schools that are better funded. Research from EdBuild, which is a research firm out of New Jersey that just looks at enrollment in public schools and private schools in the United States and the funding that goes to those schools. And they found that overwhelmingly in predominantly non-white schools, they're receiving less money than predominantly white schools to the tune of $23 billion, which breaks down to about $2,000 more per white student in predominantly white schools. And so when you have that unequal footing, something like affirmative action is a useful tool when you have students who are non-white going to these schools not having the education access that a lot of white students have. They don't have as fair of a chance to get to those high test scores, to get to that top academic decile. And I think that's at the heart of this. And the solution to that is correcting those racial disparities in K through 12 education. I think we really have to do that. But I think your point about, the Nigerian prince or whatever versus someone who's like the great grandson of a sharecropper is useful. And I think schools should be making considerations about people's backgrounds culturally. I don't think the racial categories in the United States are particularly useful, but I also don't see affirmative action as a policy that was harmful or ever did more harm than good. I think the criticism would be it didn't go far enough and acted like a crutch for universities to not do more to address the issue of racial and socioeconomic disparities.
It was harmful to a lot of the people that it purported to help. There's a ton of scholarship on the idea of mismatch theory, which found that although standardized tests have been accused of being biased, they actually are really predictive of academic success. When we look at law schools, for example, Black admittance to law schools tend to have about 10 points lower on average scores on their LSAT. They also are far more likely to fail their first attempt at passing the bar. So we can say we're trying to help people who are underserved by getting them admitted into college, but clearly that's not simply the answer, because you end up having these people spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to law school, and then they don't get to become a lawyer. So that's not helping them, that's actually really failing them. And so I think we keep coming back to this idea that if we're going to address any racial disparity in education, it has to happen sooner. And the answer is not necessarily more funding in education. There are a lot of schools, DC Public School is a great example, that are some of the highest funded in the entire country and still have some of the worst outcomes. So I think we need to be a little bit more creative in our solutions than just throwing money at the problem.
Yeah, I don't think the solution is just to aimlessly throw money at the schools. It's got to be an investment in the quality of the schools, which is not something we've seen in recent years in the United States, especially when we see the focus for a lot of schools to be going towards charter schools nearby or private schools nearby. It's got to be more funding to the schools, but it's also got to be an investment in the teachers and having high quality teachers in the classroom with the students. And also, if that funding is not correcting that issue of having teachers that are not well trained to be in front of a classroom, and also the teacher to student ratio. Funding is one thing, but if that funding is not being used to address the metrics that are critical for students' performance and increasing learning, then that's the chief problem there. Does that mean we shouldn't give money to schools and money is never helpful? No. We've got to give money to the schools and make sure it's going to the right things. The solution is not, well, money doesn't work, so we've got to try some other things. The solution would be, let's look at the metrics that have the most impact on creating students having high learning outcomes. And so when we do that, we have much more efficient policies that will hopefully reduce these racial disparities we see in education in the United States. But I think the solution is not to have someone like President Biden say, well, here's what colleges can do. The solution should be, let's see what we can do to get SAT scores and other metrics for college admission, because I think we're moving away from GPA and SAT scores and realizing that there are other metrics that we can measure students by. But let's invest in equalizing that across race and increasing the quality of education across the apparently still segregated lines in education. I think it's a classic neoliberal response to say, well, we're going to give some recommendations to the schools to see what they can still do, because that's much easier than addressing this problem at its root.
I certainly hope that if anything good comes out of this Supreme Court decision, which I'm obviously in favor of, if you couldn't tell, that colleges will be treating people more as individuals and identifying the various contributions that people of all races can add to the value of a university. We'll be back with more Rising after this.